November of 1985, a resort town of some 1,500 people vanished under 10 meters of salt water on the pampas of Argentina, 600 kilometers from Buenos Aires. It did not resurface for 25 years. And when the water finally pulled back, the town that came up was not the one that went under. Streets turned to salt, buildings bleached to bone, and for a while, exactly one man living alone inside them. This is Villa Epecuén, drowned once by water, and decades later, slowly handed back by it. Today, the ruins sit on the shore of a salt lake in Buenos Aires province, half a day's drive from the capital, a place most of Argentina had almost forgotten. For most of the 20th century, it was the opposite of forgotten. It was where people went to be healed. We're going to show you both versions of this place, the one that thrived and the one that came back changed. If you want more true stories about the places the map quietly erased, subscribe now. This channel exists to find them. Villa Epecuén was founded on January 23, 1921, by an entrepreneur named Arturo Vadione on the eastern shore of a salt lake in Buenos Aires province, 7 kilometers from the nearest town, Carhuay, and roughly 600 kilometers southwest of the capital. The lake itself was the whole reason anyone came. Its water ran nearly 10 times saltier than the ocean, second in concentration, by some measures, only to the Dead Sea. An English promoter marketed it as medicine. He brought in Italian scientists to certify the claim, and for the next 60 years, Argentines believed it, that this water could treat arthritis, skin disease, rheumatism, almost anything that ailed you. Doctors of the era prescribed weeks-long cures at the lake the way a modern physician might prescribe physical therapy. Entire families arrived by train with steamer trunks, planning to stay the season. They built a town to hold the believers. By the 1970s, Villa Epecuén had close to 1,500 permanent residents and hotel capacity for another 5,000 to 6,000 more. Every summer from November to March, as many as 25,000 tourists arrived, filling close to 280 hotels, guest houses, and bathhouses along streets that ran straight down to the water. The infrastructure kept pace with the crowds. Between 1968 and 1971, the town built a bathing complex around a pool the size of a city block, 1,600 square meters of water, plus a smaller pool for children with a cement boardwalk along the beach, changing rooms, a first aid station, and a massage parlor. A hotel on the town's main avenue, built in 1936, had grown by the 1980s into a 120-bed property with 59 rooms. At the Confiteria Corradini on the same avenue, tourists gathered most evenings for the same ritual, a glass of vermouth before dinner. There was a casino, there were parks, a train station, a church built by an Italian architect brought over for exactly that purpose. For Argentina's middle class, a week at Epecuén's salt baths was an attainable luxury. This was a workaday resort, not an elite retreat. None of it looked like a place with an expiration date. But 3 kilometers inland, in the same years the town kept filling up, an unfinished piece of government engineering was quietly deciding otherwise. In 1975, the provincial government began building the Embankment Canal, a channel meant to link the region's lagoons together, moving water from basin to basin so that none of them would flood and none would run dry. It was still unfinished, mid-construction, when Argentina's military government seized power in March of 1976. The project was left exactly as it stood. No gates, no regulation, no one assigned to watch it. For the next decade, water that should have been distributed and controlled instead drained into the Epecuen basin with nowhere to go, because the lake had no natural outlet of its own. The lake began rising, 50, 60 centimeters a year every year for 10 straight years, while a roughly 4-meter earthen embankment along the shore held the water back from the town's front streets. For a while, the embankment was enough. On the night of November 6, 1985, an unusual weather system, a sudestada, a storm driven in off the southeast, set off what meteorologists call a cyc, a standing wave that sloshes back and forth inside an enclosed body of water, the way water moves in a bathtub when you push it from one end. A smaller containment nearby gave way first. 4 days later, in the early hours of November 10, 1985, the town's own embankment failed. Rescue workers went door to door before dawn, waking residents and ordering an immediate evacuation. Water began moving into Villa Epecuén almost imperceptibly at first, under an inch an hour. Streets flooded ankle deep, then knee-deep within days. Within 2 to 3 weeks, by most local accounts, the entire town was underwater. The following month, Argentina's Revista Gent, one of the country's biggest weekly magazines, ran a photo essay on the evacuation. Families loading trucks, furniture stacked in the beds of pickups, water already lapping at doorsteps behind them. Residents had roughly 15 days warning to get out once the embankment gave way. Not 15 hours, 15 days, long enough to argue about it, to hope it would stop, to watch the water climb past furniture they had decided, right up until the last morning, not to move. No one died. Every one of the town's roughly 1,500 residents made it out alive, a fact nearly every account of Epecuen repeats, because it is the one clean mercy inside the disaster. But the water did not stop rising once the town stood empty. It kept climbing for years afterward, through the late 80s and into the early 90s, fed by the same unregulated system that had caused the flood in the first place. By the early 1990s, the lake stood roughly 10 meters above the old streets of Epecuen, 3-story buildings reduced to a rumor beneath the surface. One Argentine newspaper, writing decades later, called it exactly what it was: not a natural disaster, but in its own words, the product of human action. A catastrophe assembled piece by bureaucratic piece out of an abandoned canal, an overwhelmed embankment, and 10 years in which no one in charge was watching the water climb. For the next quarter century, Villa Epecuén existed only as a shape on old maps, and a story people from Carhué told visitors, pointing out at the water. 10 meters down, sometimes more, sat everything the town had been: hotel lobbies, the casino floor, the pool built for 1,600 square meters of summer crowds, the church the Italian architect built, front porches where people used to sit and watch the same lake that would eventually take them. Salt water does not simply drown a town, it works on it slowly for as long as the town stays under. Wood rotted, metal corroded, but brick and concrete, the materials Epecuen was mostly built from, sat down there largely intact, waiting, brined in a lake now 10 times saltier than the sea, a lake that would eventually give the town back changed rather than gone. Above the surface, the story went quiet. Argentina had a great deal to think about in the years after 1985, a return to democracy, runaway inflation, a full economic collapse in 2001, and a drowned resort town for retirees and tourists was not, for most of the country, a priority. The displaced families of Epecuen mostly resettled 7 kilometers away, in Carhué, rebuilding on dry ground. Many never went back to look at the water again. By the 1990s, if you had asked most Argentines under 30 what Villa Epecuén was, few could have told you. The lake had absorbed the town so completely that its erasure looked, from the outside, exactly like nothing having happened there at all. No formal survey or dive expedition mapped the submerged town during those years. There is no known photographic record of Epecuen between its disappearance in 1985 and the first ruins breaking the surface roughly 2 decades later, a town that existed for that entire stretch only in memory and in water nobody was documenting. Then in 2009, the weather that had drowned Epecuen reversed itself. A drought settled over Buenos Aires province. Rain that had fed the lake for decades simply stopped arriving in the same volume, and with nothing replenishing it, Lago Epecuen began, for the first time in 25 years, to shrink. The water pulled back at the same patient, unhurried pace it had used to rise. And as it dropped, it left behind something nobody in 1985 could have predicted. Not ruins the way a fire or an earthquake leaves ruins, but ruins reformed by 10 times the ocean's salt. Every surface the water had touched for 25 years came up coated white. Brick walls turned the color of bone. Concrete crystallized until it caught the light like quartz. Dead trees stood leafless and saul-trimed, branches still reaching in whatever direction they had been growing the night the water first arrived. Roads reappeared with their painted center lines still faintly visible. The old bathing complex resurfaced too, the great pool's edges, the boardwalk, all of it drained now and rimed white instead of blue. Building foundations came up in neat grids, street after street of them, laid out exactly where 1920s engineers had put them, a town-shaped skeleton, bleached and precise. In 2011, the photographer Juan Mabramada walked through the half-exposed ruins and shot a series of images that ran through international wire services, the first time most of the world outside Argentina had ever seen the place. The pictures traveled fast. BBC News would later cover it as the underwater town story. Other outlets reached for comparisons. Argentina's Pompeii. Argentina's Atlantis, trying to name something that didn't have an obvious precedent. A short documentary, Pablo's Villa, followed in 2013, built entirely around the one man who had moved back in. Cable series built around abandoned places picked up the story after that, Epecuen turning up as an episode of Abandoned Engineering, and again on Mysteries of the Abandoned, each one sending a new crew out to film the same salt-white streets. By then, enough of Epecuen had resurfaced that people began driving out from Carhué just to see it. A resort town that had come back from 25 years underwater looking less like a ruin and more like a photograph left too long in the sun. It became, without anyone planning it, one of Argentina's stranger tourist attractions, not a place people visit despite the disaster, but because of exactly what the disaster left behind. The lake itself, not just the ruins, came back into use. In 2001, nearby Carhué began redeveloping around its own thermal baths, a spa complex that today accounts for more than 700 hotel beds, built partly on the same promise of healing water that had built Epecuen 80 years earlier. And on January 29, 2017, 1,941 people waded into Lago Epecuen, joined hands, and floated together in a single unbroken chain, a Guinness World Record, set in the same super saline water that had once been marketed as medicine, then turned into a flood. The ruins themselves gained legal standing during those same years. In 2013, the municipality of Adolfo Alsina, Carhué's district, formally designated the site a protected architectural heritage asset. The province of Buenos Aires followed with its own provincial law in 2015. A town that had spent a quarter century as nobody's responsibility was, by then, officially somebody's to protect. One person did not wait for the photographers or the tourists. Pablo Novak was born on January 25, 1930, on a small farm about 200 meters from the resort, close enough that Epecuen was less a town he visited than the place his whole life happened in view of. His father made bricks for a living. By Novak's own account, bricks from his father's yard went into roughly 70% of everything ever built in Epecuen, including, very possibly, some of the same buildings the lake would later swallow and hand back. When the evacuation came in 1985, Novak left with everyone else, but he never fully let go of the place. When the water started retreating in 2009, he was among the first back, watching the streets of his own youth reappear a little more with every dry season, until, by most accounts, he was living there again full-time by 2011. Alone by choice. He built himself a shelter among the ruins, using a propane stove for cooking, and from 2022 on, solar panels the local municipality installed for him. He read newspapers, magazines, and books his children brought him, and listened to a battery-powered radio. He had no real use, he said, for television. He walked his dog and rode his bicycle through the ruined streets every day, less exercise than ritual. Locals came to call him El Guardián de Epecuen, the Guardian of Epecuen, and in 2020, the district of Adolfo Alsina formally named him its cultural and tourism ambassador. He liked the company his solitude attracted. All weekends, people come to know Epecuen and me, he told an interviewer in his last years. I like it. That's why I'm here. Otherwise, I'd be with family in Carhué. I like that they come see me. Journalists kept coming back to him across more than a decade, first as a curiosity in his late 70s, then by his late 80s and early 90s as something closer to a living monument. Each new visit measured the same two things: how much more of the town the lake had given up, and how much older the man guarding it had gotten. He was, by the end, one of the very few people anywhere who had watched an entire town vanish, and then slowly, personally watched it come back. Novak told his own version of the town's origin story too, worth repeating with a flag attached, because it comes from him, not from any independent record. He said that his father once spoke with the Italian architect who built Epecuén's church, and that the architect told him the whole basin had flooded before, back in 1918, and that these cycles, he believed, repeat roughly every 100 years. No outside source confirms a 1918 flood at Epecuen. It may be family memory or folklore, or simply a fact that never made it into any surviving record. We're telling you what he said, not vouching for it as established history. Novak's wife died in Carhué in August of 2023. He kept living in the ruins anyway, with 10 children, 25 grandchildren, and 9 great-grandchildren scattered around him, none of them talking him out of staying. He died in the final days of January 2024, just short of his 94th birthday. If I die, he had said, I want it to be here. His family scattered his ashes among the ruins, honoring exactly that. Nearly 40 years after the flood, Argentina had at last formally lost its final resident of Villa Epecuén. Within the year, the site was officially recognized as an uninhabited ghost town. A resort was built to convince people that this water could heal them. A decade of bureaucratic neglect proved the same water could just as easily erase them. And 25 years of patient retreat proved it could, eventually, hand almost all of it back, changed, salted, but recognizably itself. Villa Epecuén was drowned by water, held by water, and finally returned by water. 3 different chapters told by the same substance, on the same stretch of Argentine pampas most of the country still cannot quite place on a map. The ruins are open to visitors now. The streets still run in their original grid, and somewhere inside that white, salt-crusted skeleton of a town, there is a spot where, on one day in 2024, one family let one man go exactly where he had asked to. This is Vanishing. Every place we cover has a reason it disappeared. This one disappeared twice and came back changed both times.